Megan Miranda grew up in New Jersey and studied biology and anthropology at MIT, where she won awards in bioengineering. She worked in biotechnology for several years before teaching high school science. She is the author of a number of novels for young adults and adults. Her adult debut book, All the Missing Girls, was a top title of 2016 and featured on the New York Times bestseller list. The Perfect Stranger is her second novel of psychological suspense and came out in 2017. And her newest book, The Last House Guest, also on the New York Times bestseller list, just published June 18th. Welcome to Seattle. Thank you for being with us, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, welcome.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you here. Have you been to Seattle before?
This is my very first time
This
in
is your
Seattle.
First time. Welcome to Seattle.
Thank you.
I love your cover here. I was just saying to you a few minutes ago before we got started that it's a very Seattle book. We understand this cover.
Yes, with the rain.
With the rain. And you were saying that you've been bringing
Yes,
rain with you.
I'd say 80% of my tour stops so far, I have brought the rain with me. So I just feel like I'm bringing the ambiance of the book cover. Yeah.
It's great. And we're not raining at the moment, so
Surprise.
maybe it's the opposite. So you grew up in New Jersey, and currently you're in, is it North
Carolina? Yes.
Okay. And MIT, science,
Right.
teaching,
Right.
murder.
Yes.
It's a little bit of a journey.
It's the path.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that came?
How like murder and how it all goes together. So I grew up reading thrillers. I'm a huge thriller fan. My mom was a big thriller reader, and that's what was in our house a lot. Mm-hmm. So I've always been drawn to sort of the darker types of books, even growing up. And I loved writing and reading, but I also loved science. And I didn't know anyone who was a writer when I was in school, and I was very type A, so I did know the career path for science. So I figured, if I got a degree in biology, I could have a job in biotech, and I would keep writing on the side. Okay. But the truth is I gave up writing for a while. I got busy with my career. I got busy, I made a lot of excuses for myself, I think, but I never stopped reading. So I worked in biotech for a few years, and then when we moved to North Carolina, I became a high school science teacher. And when I eventually sat down and really focused on writing my first book, it kind of took pieces from all of my different jobs in the past. It was a young adult novel set in the world of high school, and it had a weird science what-if angle to it. A lot of my young adult books have a little bit of a speculative element to them. So I felt like it all kind of came together in my writing at first and progressed from there.
Awesome.
And murder.
Yes. So that wasn't something from your casual life?
No.
Okay.
No.
So you just mentioned you've delved into speculative or sci-fi realms in your young adult work, and then in your 3 adult novels, you haven't.
No,
really.
I haven't.
It's been.
They're all kind of contemporary.
Is there a reason that you've kind of kept your speculative in the realm of the young adult books, or just is that kind of how it's shaken out?
It's just sort of how it's shaken out. I think it depends on the story, and with the adult psychological suspense I've been writing, I think I'm really drawn to sort of the mysteries inside people and kind of like what's really happening in the people around us. How well do we know the people we think we know? And those are kind of the themes I keep coming back to in those stories.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Do you think you'll ever kind of merge
Maybe. Right now the ideas I have are sort of more in line with what I've been writing, but I won't say never.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's probably better not to say never.
Right.
I hear
because
from
then,
other
yes.
writers. Because you're like, I'm never going to revisit that world next year. It's like, by the way,
I did that with my first book. I said, no, I'll never write a sequel, and then 2 books later.
And that's the only sequel.
It's the only
continuation
one.
you've done so far, right?
Right,
Okay.
yes.
And I did notice too, going back to sort of how you've drawn on your career pathway. In The Perfect Stranger, you had a character who goes into a rural area to be a high school teacher.
She did. And she became a teacher in a similar way to the way I did, where we kind of went in a different way, where you were kind of becoming certified as you were learning on the job at the same time. So I did draw a little bit from it wasn't completely my experience, but something I was familiar with.
But you haven't had characters in your adult novels be in the biotech kind of fields yet.
I have not yet.
Is there a reason you've chosen not to do that?
No, you know what? It's a good question. Why haven't I had someone in the biotech world? I think for me, because I worked in biotech when I was in Boston, I associate that part of my life and that field with the city. And so far I've been drawn, I love writing these small towns. So I don't think there's a real reason other than that's sort of, in my mind. I'm like, oh, Boston, biotech, and everything so far is rural, small town, what's hidden under the surface.
Let's lean into the small town thing really quick.
Yeah.
Your fiction is so setting oriented, and it is so immersive for that reason. Your settings are very, very crafted, they are characters in their own right a lot of the time, particularly in your adult novels. And All the Missing Girls takes place in the woods, a forest, essentially. And a lot of Perfect Stranger does as well, but they're, a lake with woods. And then this new book is a vacation town in Maine, which is a little bit of a departure, but can you tell us a little bit about how you go about crafting settings so vividly, and just why the woods so prominently, and then this kind of almost right-hand turn into something entirely different, but no less immersive.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you very much. I love setting. That's sort of one of my favorite things, to think of a setting as a character that can really influence the tone of a story. And that, especially in this book, I felt like a lot of the characters, I wanted them to be sort of very tightly tied to the setting and almost come out of it, to grow from growing up in a place like this. For All the Missing Girls, which is set in a small town in North Carolina, when I was working on the book, I took a trip to the mountains and stayed on the edge of the mountains. And I love to kind of write in that immersive setting, because it's all those little details that you can hear the wind coming before it reaches you. And when I was writing there, it made me think, this is the type of place where you could almost believe in legends. And that's something I took into that story, that the characters talk about legends like maybe they're real. But I love to make up all of my places. All the towns are completely fictional. And I do take bits and pieces of sort of places that I feel like I have an emotional connection to.
Okay.
Or sort of have a visceral memory of. And so in All the Missing Girls, there are no caverns in sort of the towns in North Carolina I had visited. But I have this memory of visiting caverns in Virginia when I was very small in elementary school, where they turned off all the lights to show us what absolute darkness was.
Oh, wow.
And it is something that has stuck with me ever since. And so I wanted to put that in that story, and to have this town that's kind of grown up around these caverns that have been shut down, but that the kids kind of sneak into and play in. Or in high school. For The Last House Guest, so I'm always drawn to woods. My first instinct is always mountains and woods and creepiness. I love stories that are set in the woods. I grew up with woods behind my house, not to the extent of these characters, but in my memory, I was always playing in them. And when I was starting to write this story, at first I thought the woods. But I really started here. I usually start with a character, and in this case I started with a setting where I wanted to have a town that could be seen from two perspectives, both as an insider who grew up in the town and as an outsider who maybe only sees it part of the time. So I knew I wanted to have a vacation town.
Okay.
And my mind went straight to Maine, because I grew up in New Jersey, but my dad's from Maine. And so every year we would drive up the coast, it's a 10-hour drive, up to Bar Harbor, and we would spend a week there. And my best friend would come with us as well, because I was an only child. And I have all these great memories of hiking there. We would hike in Acadia, and then in the evenings we'd explore towns. So I knew I wanted to set it in Maine, but I hadn't been back since I was 18 or 19 years old. And so when I was nearing the end of my very first draft, I asked my family if anyone wanted to take a research trip up with me. And this is how I ended up on a summer vacation with my parents, my husband, and my 2 small children in one minivan for a week, driving up and down the coast, which is like the start of a thriller in and of itself. But it was really fun and really interesting to see it from everyone's different perspective. I was trying to kind of place memories from 2 decades earlier. My parents still go up every year, and then my kids and my husband were seeing it for the very first time. And I wanted to think about really capturing the setting, but the thing I realized about each town as I was driving is that they each had such a distinct, unique feel. Mm-hmm. And so that was really what I took away from this, that I really just wanted to have Littleport feel distinct and unique, that there could be no other place but this. And just being there really helped capture the feeling of, town set between the mountains on one side and the ocean on the other, and kind of the feel of the water and the wind and everything. But yeah, it was.
And within Littleport,
Mm-hmm.
you not only have a town as a character and populated it with characters, but your main character, Avery, is she works for the wealthy family and oversees all of these vacation homes. So then you have all of, not just the people in the town, but you have the vacation homes within the vacation town.
Right.
And you gave them all names. And you gave them all personalities. Yes. So you had to create not just characters, but like mini settings within the setting. So what was that like? It was like this nesting doll.
It was, and I feel like I've created this whole town now. Mm-hmm. It did kind of take on a life of its own, where at first I was like, all right, all I had was like the beach and like a road that went up to where the Lomans lived, and then it sort of like expanded. Every place Avery would go would just expand. And then at one point when I turned in a draft, my editor was like, do you have a map of this? And I was like, no, but I will make a map of this. And I mean, it's terribly hand-drawn, but I did eventually kind of draw a map. And when we were up there, like every house did sort of, a lot of the vacation town houses would have names to them. And so I thought about what they would name it based on the different characteristics, and kind of went from there.
It was so convincing. Like, I'm reading this book, and you're like, and this, this one house was at the top of this road. And I'm like, oh, clearly it's at the top of that road. What other road would it be at the top of? And I'm like, wait, this is an entirely fictional town. It's so fascinating, because I felt like when I was reading The Perfect Stranger, it was like a nesting doll of plot. Yeah. But then this one, not only was it a nesting doll of plot, but it was like a nesting doll of setting. And I was just like, there's character, and there's settings that are characters, but then there's within this other setting, and it was just really very, very well done. It was very
I think it evolved over the course of many drafts.
That was my next question. Like, how much of it was present in the first draft? And I read in an interview with you that you actually had trouble finding the format for this book, more so than some of your other books. What was that process like?
So because I started with like the internal, like I wanted to have an insider versus an outsider perspective, I thought at first that I was writing from 2 characters' point of view.
Interesting.
And so
which you've done in another book.
I did it in my young adult book, Come Find Me. But there was something not sort of gelling when I did it that way. And it was when I was up on this trip to Maine that I really thought about what the right perspective was. And there was one instance that made me think about this. So when I was a teenager, we've done this hike called the Beehive up in Maine, and it basically looks like a giant beehive. And it was like the most fun hike I could ever remember, because there were like all these rungs and ladders, and I remember kind of racing down this trail with my best friend and my parents behind us. And so I thought, I'm gonna do this again when I was in Maine 2 years ago. And it was a completely different experience with 2 small children. It was terrifying. I could tell you nothing about this hike, because I spent the entire time trying to convince my children to make a human chain and like shimmy against the wall. And they were like, oh, Mom, no, because they're in middle school. And that's what they say. And that's when I sort of realized, at the end, I was like, Mom, why didn't you tell me this was terrifying? And she goes, oh, it was completely terrifying. But, you were fine, so we kept doing it. But it made me really think about, okay, so I wasn't writing about the perspective of 2 different people, but maybe just one person, and how the relationship with a place changes over time. And that's when I realized, okay, no, what I was really structuring this book on was time, and the event that she can't really let go of, which is the +1 party, where everyone is. It's the start of the book. Everyone's at this +1 party, which is for everyone who's been there for the summer season +1 week. And that's where they were when Sadie is found dead at the start of the book. And so every 5 chapters, you keep coming back to this +1 party the summer before, and as she learns more in the present, it's sort of shifting her memories and understanding of the past. So that's when everything clicked, like draft 4.
Wow, wow.
3 drafts more than I was hoping.
But you got there.
I did.
And it works really, really well.
Thank you.
You're really good at building that sort of discovery. Like the reader discovers along with the character. But you did one of those books backward.
I did.
You have a character like still making discoveries, but I know we're talking about this book, but I have to ask you
for
about
all the missing girls.
How did you always know that book was going to be written backward?
Yeah.
Okay.
So sometimes it takes me many versions to find the right way, and
way.
well, sometimes so that book was conceived basically with the idea that I wanted to tell a mystery in reverse as a way to explore character motivation, so that as you're moving back in time, you were stripping another layer of why something happened. And it took me a lot of drafts as well. It took me a little while to find the right story for it as well. I wanted it to be tied very tightly to the theme of going back in the past for answers, have a character who was really tied to that as well. And it was a constantly evolving draft. I write in a program called Scrivener that lets you kind of make note cards as you're going. And so what I would do for each scene is I would keep a note card of what the reader knew at any given point in time, and another for what the narrator knew at any given point in time. And so the goal was to walk the line between those two, but it constantly changed because they don't do a lot of upfront plotting. So every time I'd reach a new day, I'd be like, oh, that's what that piece is, and then everything I'd already written would have to change because that happens after. But it was the project I kept coming back to, the idea that I couldn't let go of, that just like had such a grip on me that I was like, this is the story that I want to tell and need to tell, and I'm so happy it eventually got there in the end. But it was a process, but it was like my passion project too.
Was that one always conceived of as an adult mystery, or is it based on the type of story you want to tell, whether you determine whether it's young adult or adult, or is it more like I want to hang out with this character for a while, or like how do you determine?
For me, it's really all about the character. And for me, like a hallmark of young adult fiction is sort of this immediacy to it, because a lot of times a character is trying to kind of find an emotional understanding of the events because they're experiencing it for the first time. And in my adult stories, I think about kind of filtering that perspective through 10 or 20 or 30 years of experience. So there's a little bit of an element of hindsight. So when I first started All the Missing Girls, I wasn't sure. I had conceived of the backstory first, of what happened when the characters were 18. And it took me a little while to realize what this story was missing was this element of hindsight, and that it was going to be a character who has to go back into the past for answers. And therefore, this was a character who was looking back at the time she was 18, who wasn't 18. And that's when I realized, okay, this is an adult story. I'm writing an adult book. So it wasn't that I set out to be like, I want to write an adult story, and this is what I'm going to do. It's really more about which ideas fit which type of character.
Can you do that a little bit again in Last House Guest? Avery has a bit of a past.
Yes.
And is, even though the book itself isn't necessarily constantly flashing back specifically to scenes written in that past, she herself is constantly trying to build her future with an eye to like not just what has happened in her own mind, but one of the reasons I find Avery such a fascinating character is that in your past books, your narrators are a little bit unreliable. Either they're flat out hiding something from the reader, or they, as in Perfect Stranger, they don't have all the information. But in this book, you play with the unreliable narrator a little bit because she's trying really hard to be reliable, but it's the entire town that views her as unreliable.
They don't trust her at all.
How did you switch up that kind of process?
So one of the things I'm drawn to, like you were saying, in all the books is sort of the past and how it affects us. I think it's a theme I keep coming back to, whether you can ever escape the people you used to be or the person you used to be. In this book in particular, it was really about, can you escape how others see you? And Avery had a tumultuous upbringing. She suffered a lot of loss along the way, and she did do some things in the past that make her seem untrustworthy. And even though she is very competent at her job now, and she is in her mid-20s, they are never going to see her as someone other than this teenager who was rebellious and didn't really play by the rules, and she has to constantly fight against that. And I think it's really hard when everyone sees you a certain way to believe that you're something else as well, and that's something I really wanted to explore in
and you
this story.
purposely bring her up against almost literally everyone involved in that past, very deliberately.
Yes.
The cops who were involved in certain scenes, or the people she stayed with after certain things happened, or her friends that were alienated through various means. Like you very carefully and consciously bring her up against all of these different people.
And I think especially in a small town, she is going to run into these people on a daily basis. And I think that's a reason I'm drawn to these types of stories in small towns, is because you have to come face to face with your past. You're going to run into it constantly. And can you ever move past it or prove you're something else?
How did it differentiate the process of writing this book, where a lot of people in this small town leave?
Yeah.
There are the people who stay there year round, but a lot of people leave and come back, and she sees a lot of these people who leave and come back. Yeah. How did you go about kind of writing those relationships as different than your first few books, where you have your narrators coming back, or coming to a place for the first time and meeting people?
Right. Whereas I'd say in All the Missing Girls and in Perfect Stranger, they're more the outsider who's coming to town, whereas Avery is very much an insider in the town. However, she sort of feels that she's become an outsider to it, because she has
no matter how hard she tries.
Yes, yeah. And so I think at some point she gives herself over to that, where she lives on the Loman's property, and she lives in their guest house, and she has sort of an insight into the inner working of their lives, but she's really a member of neither group anymore. And it was really interesting because I think for her, she kind of associates Sadie with summer, and she sees can you have a friendship that just exists in this one part of the year? And I think for her, that's how she views her life. That's when the excitement starts. So she was waiting for Sadie to return. And so there is, I tried to really contrast the summer versus the winter, especially with her view of things. In the winter, the visitors are gone, and she really can only be who she used to be. That's how everyone saw her. But in the summer, she can become somebody else with the other people there.
What parts of writing, let's change tack slightly. We've talked about your sort of specific mystery or thriller stories. Let's talk about kind of mystery with a capital M.
Okay.
As just the genre.
Yeah.
You write in a genre that is full of tropes.
Yeah.
And we've talked a little bit about why you're drawn to this genre, because, you were raised on sort of these stories, and these are the stories that have kind of, gotten into your head. How do you go about sort of navigating an arena where there are all of these things that are sort of you've very clearly, very cleverly twisted them to make them your own in a lot of ways and turn them on their head? What's it like to be in a sandbox where there's all of these things that it's okay, this has been done so many times, how can I make it different? Or do you ever start something and you're this has been done, I don't want to do this anymore?
I think that's a fear, because I think if you think too much about it, everything has been done in one way or another, and so I have to think what's my take on it. And since I'm not somebody who starts with plot, I always think about character. So what makes this character unique? And once I think about it as their journey, I don't so much worry about
falling into a rut.
Yeah, because I feel like I'm following kind of the character arc instead of the plot twist. And that is how I kind of plot out a book, and I don't do a lot of upfront plotting, but I think a lot about character, subtle twists that maybe change the perspective of what the reader thinks is really happening. So that's really, I try to just channel a character instead of, the mystery element.
Where do you get your ideas for characters? Do
Yeah.
they just sort of manifest themselves in your, or are you ever like in a conversation with someone or watching something and you're like, that would be, how does that kind of spark itself for you?
So in All the Missing Girls, it was a very specific moment. So I grew up in New Jersey and moved to North Carolina over a decade ago, and we do that drive a lot. It's like a 10 to 12 hour drive, and the scenery changes so dramatically as you go. You're going through rural areas, you go through cities. Virginia is like endless on this drive, and we were doing and as I get closer to New Jersey, every time I feel myself becoming the person I used to be, because I haven't been there since I was 18, and all my family is there, and they know me a certain way. And it was when I was taking this drive back to North Carolina that I started to hear or imagine the character who became Nick, that she was seeing pieces of her past along the roadside as she went home. And it's the first scene I wrote of the story, and she's driving back home after being called home by her brother, and she sees the ghosts of Corinne and her and Bailey walking down the side of the road. And that kind of sparked Nick for me, and from there I was able to say, okay, so why hasn't she been back in 10 years? What is she running from? Why does everyone see her a certain way? And so she kind of took on a life of her own from there. But I really have to write my way into stories to get to know the characters, and then I take a step back and figure out kind of what they have to go up against. And I think my goal always is that at some point the character has to come face to face with themselves in some way, and so I'm always trying to think of a plot that works against kind of their character arc, if that makes sense.
And it usually involves a body in
Always,
some way.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
It helps.
Has there ever been a character that you've started writing and you're going along and you're like, this is a side character? Has that ever happened to you? Or has it always kind of been like, this is the main character of this story?
The main character has usually stuck. There was another character in this story that I thought was going to be kind of another main character and became a side character, where I was like, no, this is Avery's story. And yeah, I had to kind of reshift that a little bit.
In your YA as well?
Yeah, in my YA, there have been a few characters that started small and became larger. I'd say it works more that way, where I think, oh, you're just going to be, your role is over here, and all of a sudden they're like, a huge part, and like a character I really grow to incorporate a lot more in the story than I thought I would.
Yeah, another reason I get so engrossed in your work is that all of the characters feel so real. And like in this one, you have the people from her past and like the people that she's trying to be in a relationship with now, and you have the differentiation between the people who are there all year and the people who come for the summer. And All the Missing Girls, you have the people she knew, and all of the characters are so real and so flawed. Like, how do you build such realistic people?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like because I do a lot of revising, I feel like by the time I kind of sit down to write like the third or the fourth draft, you know them so much better than you did from the start, that you're able to kind of incorporate all those elements. I do try to find like an emotional thing that I can relate to in each character. A lot of times it is a flaw, and I just feel like if you can have like an emotional connection to one, then you can authentically write that character. So I just try to find one little thing in everyone.
A lot of your characters, when they are like, you work a lot with the past, and can you outgrow or outrun who you were and who you're becoming and that kind of thing. You also deal a lot with grief and trauma, and you go to some dark places, but it never feels like you're inflicting it on your characters. It feels like your characters are working through all of these things that make them very real, very human, very relatable. How do you get yourself into those darker places, and what do you do to bring yourself out of that and balance that? Because you're a wife, you're a mom, you're a daughter, you have a life, you have family. Like, how do you live in those spaces but
That's a good
keep yourself
question.
healthy.
Yeah, no, it is important too. So even though I grew up reading thrillers, I was also like a kid who was afraid of everything. And so
It's so funny how they often go together, isn't it?
Yes.
I was the same way. Yeah.
And I was like, why am I always drawn to these types of stories when I am like terrified of so many things? But I think as the reader, it's because I was taking the journey through alongside the character, and you make it out the other side. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I try to view these stories. Like, we're going to go through some darkness, and the goal is we're going to make it through the other side. And so that, I always do have that in my mind. And I also am somebody who's very structured with my writing, and I have very set work hours, and I think that helps as well, where I go to my office and I write, and at the end of the day, like when the school bus comes, I shut my laptop, I leave the laptop, I shut the door, and that part of my life stays there. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's important to have that differential.
How do you facilitate getting to those darker places? I read in an interview you have playlists and that kind of thing.
I do.
Like, is it all playlists, or do you ever like?
Yeah, I do try to. The playlists help me with a tone of either a character or a scene, or to get me in the right headspace for it. I do watch television shows, mm-hmm. I read, I listen to music, and I'll reread what I've written up to that part a lot too, because mm-hmm. I think it's hard sometimes to jump back into something, especially that's like emotionally dark, and so I will often reread kind of days leading up to that to kind of get back into that headspace. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there a particular reason you think you kind of like to revisit some of these particular stories?
Yeah,
like the you work a lot with grief.
Right.
There's a lot, and I know that's grief is a very necessary mm-hmm. part of human existence, right. And it's a very important thing. I feel like it's not addressed enough in writing, and so it's really refreshing to read your books, because like you really delve into it in a good way. Do you do that purposely, or is it just something you're like, oh, here we go again, we're writing about?
I do. I think there are sort of like universal emotions and experiences, and I do try to tap into what they are. Mm-hmm. And my young adult book this year, Come Find Me, is also mm-hmm. deals with grief, but maybe not facing it head on at first, but coming around to it. And while I'm writing it, I am like, these are very sad things people have to work through, but the goal is always like you're working through it mm-hmm. and you're making it through. So I think I'm drawn to these things because they are the dark, scary things that I worried about and worry about, and you are taking that journey through it mm-hmm. and coming out the other side.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any questions? Anybody? I have more things we can talk about. I wanted to open it up. You have a question?
So you talk about small towns mm-hmm. and creepy things and insiders and outsiders, and that makes me think of the films of David Lynch. Is he an influence?
Oh, I feel like I take influence from a lot of different places. I love any sort of settings that feel like characters. Mm-hmm. I like, Gillian Flynn's like sharp objects, and I love those sort of like small town creepy vibes. But I wouldn't say there's like one particular, but all small towns I will read. I will watch every show set in them, every movie, yes.
I always find myself, if it's a show,
I'm
just like, at some point you have to know your body count is unusually high. You just have to know.
For the population control. Yes.
Mathematically speaking, I feel like we're in a little bit of a...
Do any of your characters resemble people that you grew up with in the areas you mentioned?
Good question.
That is a good question. And I always say that like everything is completely fictional. And in my mind, I believe everything is completely fictional. But people who know me will read it and they won't see themselves in things, but they'll see pieces of me in different characters. And then I'll do things subconsciously, like my very first book, I accidentally named the parents one letter off my own parents' names, and I had no idea, like no one told me. Made it all the way till it was published, and then my aunt was like, "That's really funny that you did that," and I was like, I didn't mean to. And the dad was an accountant and my mom's an accountant. And so I think you sort of naturally like take little bits and pieces of things you're familiar with, but I wouldn't say any characters built like off of one person, but there are definitely like little pieces of things that you'll find if you know me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you see yourself doing other forms of writing in future?
Right now, I find myself really drawn to this type of story, and I kind of see things in this structure. I think so. Right now, I think this is where I'll be. Yeah.
I have. How are we doing on time? Can someone? I don't have my phone with me. 10 more minutes? Okay. So I have a couple more questions for you. You mentioned Gillian Flynn, one of the sort of go-tos of your chosen kind of genre. In an era where novels like Gone Girl, Sharp Objects, Girl on the Train are kind of the go-to thrillers, do you feel your work is in conversation with some of these books at all alongside them? You know, you're all presenting, it's so refreshing to have so many female protagonists to choose from, and they're so flawed and so nuanced, and I'm loving that. How do you go about writing vulnerable, strong, independent, but realistic women in the Me Too era, or with the other protagonists that we sort of have?
Yeah, no, I think there are I love them all. Like there are so many wonderful female-led, character-driven suspense, and I think I do think that they are all sort of in conversation with each other, because there is no like one, you can be just the victim or just the femme fatale. Like you can be pretty much anything across the board. And what I love is I think so many of the stories kind of walk the line of like you can be many different pieces of like you can have many different versions of yourself or of a character, and that's what makes them real, is they're not just one thing. They're not just the victim. They're not just the perpetrator. They kind of encompass all of what's possible.
And you do such a great job of adding to that conversation. Do you have a protagonist who's a favorite?
So my favorite is it's always the last one I worked on, because you spend so much time in their head. And this one in particular, I've spent a lot of time in her head. It took me a few extra drafts to get this one together. So right now, Avery is my favorite. There's I find her very resilient. Like I like that about her a lot. So she's somebody that I feel connected to right now. Yeah, she's sort of, I root for her. She's been through a lot.
She really has.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really liked about this character was that she, more than a lot of the other ones, really did most of it herself. Yeah. And had to. She
was very active, I think, yeah.
Did you have difficulty writing that? It sounds like, you were all in a minivan for research for this book. Yes, like, it's obvious family is very important to you and very present in your life. Yes. So what was it like to write a character
Somebody
that was
so... Yes, it was very difficult to kind of imagine that, and I grew up in a very large family as well. I have like 18 cousins, and we grew up in a town that was very, they were a very important part of my life. And so in a way, like having that really, I wouldn't say it helped make me imagine, like, what would it be like to lose such an important element that, there was always someone around for me. There was always, if my parents weren't there, I had my cousins or my aunts or my uncles or my grandparents, and to have that all taken away from a character, I was able to kind of connect to that emotion of like how isolating that would be and how lonely. And when she meets Sadie for the first time, she is searching for something. And really wants a strong connection. And I think that facilitates that for the both of them, that they both need something in each other and really create a very strong bond because of that, because she was so alone.
And privilege also very
Mhm.
much comes into
Yes,
play in this book.
it does.
The very, very wide gulf
Yes.
between the two sort of classes
Mhm.
in this town. Was that something you set out to do consciously, or was it more, I know that you were talking about how the setting kind of lent
Yeah.
itself to the kind of perspectives you wanted to create, but like once you kind of
Mhm.
realized that was a thing where you like, I could.
Power was something like when I start with a theme a lot of the times, and other than like the past and how it affects you, power was the big one for me.
Mhm.
And thinking about it in a big scale and a small scale. So what gives someone power in a relationship? You know, is it money? Is it knowledge? What makes someone in power within a relationship? What people will do to achieve it? What they'll do to keep it. And I also wanted to go all the way down to sort of like the nuances in any sort of relationship, that, you know, which person is in power and why. Do those lines blur and shift? So that was something I did intentionally set out to explore in the story.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Are there any themes or any hints you can give us about what's coming next, or anything that you haven't quite gotten to explore that you're looking forward to exploring with some of your future projects?
Yeah, so I have, I'm in the middle of my next project, and it is going to tie similarly to the idea of the past versus, 10 or 20 years later, but it's going to be, right now anyway, it's much more defined and part of the plot as well, that it's about a character who was known in a very public way.
Okay.
At one time in her life, and I wanted to kind of explore like how that affects her years later.
And
So,
is this a new adult?
It is an adult book.
Okay.
Yes.
Are you also working on? Because for the last couple of years,
Yeah.
haven't you done one in one?
I
it's sort
have,
of
or it's kind of worked out
staggered
that
a little
way, where they've kind of come out like that. But right now, I'm just working on this
new
project. Yeah.
novel. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to read it
Thank
because
you.
Each one of your books is so different and so just like same. It's so interesting to see them in conversation with each other because you're right. You revisit some of these themes and some of these kind of ideas and larger elements, but they're all so different and so unique. And you have such great characters and settings who are characters. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks for bringing a little bit of a cool evening to Seattle with your lovely rainy window cover. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
And we look forward to reading the next one.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
It's fun.